Welcome, everyone. So excited to have you all joining us today. Just some quick housekeeping as we're getting started here. The chat is open. If you had anything that you wanted to say amongst yourselves, you're welcome to throw it into the chat. If you had a question for Bryan during the Q&A session after he's done with his presentation, if you could put it in the Q&A section, that'll be really helpful so that I can grab questions from there. But other than that, I think we'll get started here. So for those of you who don't know, this is Bryan Greene. He's our Vice President of Policy Advocacy at NAR, the National Association of Realtors. And he oversees all the legislative and regulatory advocacy on behalf of the association's 1.5 million members. Bryan joined NAR back in November of 2019, and he spent his first year at NAR raising the association's profile in Washington and nationwide on all fair housing related policy matters as NAR's first director of fair housing policy. Before joining NAR, Bryan served for 10 years as the highest ranking career official in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, where he oversaw the policy direction and operational management of the 600-person office enforcing the nation's housing anti-discrimination laws and oversight of a $150 million budget. Bryan was the 2007 recipient of the Presidential Rank Award, the highest federal honor bestowed upon any federal senior executive for outstanding service. So just those tiny small accolades here, but needless to say, Bryan, thank you so much. We are so excited to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and it's great to be with everyone today. I had the pleasure of joining you all in person last September, but it's nice to be with you all on Zoom today. And Vanessa went through that long biography. I'll say also, in that first month that I started at NAR, I visited San Francisco. In November of 2019, I started, and it was at that time that we had our annual meeting in San Francisco. And so I came out to San Francisco, I want to say, in the first 2 weeks of my starting. And so while now I oversee all of our policy advocacy, at the time I was doing fair housing. And as Vanessa said, I was the first fair housing director of fair housing policy. And when I returned from San Francisco in that wonderful annual meeting where San Francisco native Vince Malta was installed as our president, I got back to my desk, had a minute to put my bags down, and New York Newsday had done a big expose on ongoing housing discrimination in the real estate industry, where they had realtor members on camera engaging in unseemly discrimination. And so we were off to the races at that point, dealing with that issue and addressing what was apparently ongoing discrimination in our ranks. So here we are, 2024, and we're 56 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and we are still talking about discrimination and clearly still dealing with discrimination. In April, we commemorate the passage of the Fair Housing Act. It's also an opportunity for us to reflect on how far we've come. April marks when the Fair Housing Act was passed. It was passed April 11th, 1968. I always remember, or try to remember, how many years it has been since the passage of the act, because I was born that year. And so I had to ask myself, all right, so how old am I now? All right, that's how many years we've had the Fair Housing Act. I titled this talk Many Rivers to Cross because, one, it's a great song by Jimmy Cliff, but also because I really do think it kind of summarizes the journey we've had to get to a better place. But as Lyndon Johnson said when he first assigned the Fair Housing Act in 1968, we've come a long way, but not near all of it. And so Many Rivers to Cross really is a reminder that we have to keep going. And I think this kind of commemoration also affords us an opportunity to look back on what we have overcome. So this year, 2024, happens to also be the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which Dr. Martin Luther King described as the most comprehensive civil rights legislation in America. Now, mind you, this is 1964. This is over 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So people were emancipated from slavery, expecting to be full citizens of the United States, and 100 years passes. That means the entire lives of people and entire lives of at least one more generation, possibly two more generations of folks who, despite that emancipation, did not see America actually confer the guarantees of citizenship, right? We had Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was supposed to do that. We had 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were supposed to get rid of slavery, create equal citizenship and equal rights under the law, protect voting rights. All of that, despite constitutional amendments, was taken away by legislatures, Southern legislatures, and American customs, and federal courts, right? We actually maintained as official policy in the United States segregation. You had, Plessy versus Ferguson at the Supreme Court, which enshrined separate but equal, right? And it wasn't until 1954 that the Supreme Court finally said that such segregation violated the Constitution. And I try to stress that because, in political debates and public debates, there's a lot of talk about, oh, well, the discrimination that occurred was, private discrimination, or what people did, not our United States government being discriminatory. But, that's entirely fiction. And you can talk to anybody who lived through it, because the United States government, in probably the most dramatic way, engaged in segregation by segregating its armed forces. So in World War II, and we still have some World War II veterans among us, our soldiers went off to fight the Nazis, went off to save the world for democracy in segregated troops. So keep that in mind. And certainly the Nazis did, and sought to exploit the fact that we could not actually live up to our democratic ideals, even while we were fighting abroad. And it really was, it was the returning veterans from that war, realizing that hypocrisy, realizing they were coming back to American towns, states, etc., that were going to subjugate them again, would not allow them to do the basic things. It were these folks who decided we really need to fight, and they had fought a war, and they decided, all right, we should be able to vote in our own country. We should be able to go to a movie theater. We should be able to eat in a restaurant. We should be able to stay in a hotel. We should be able to buy a house. We should have everything that citizenship conferred upon us a century ago, and we should be able to enjoy the liberty and democracy that we fought for. So that's really the sort of birth of the civil rights movement. And by the time we get around to 1964, you've had the assassination of John F. Kennedy, who specifically said it was time for us to pass comprehensive civil rights legislation. And Dr. King was one of the greatest advocates for that civil rights legislation. In fact, he came to San Francisco twice in 1964 to advocate for this particular civil rights legislation. I want to say once he was at the Cow Palace, and I'm forgetting the other establishment he came to, but specifically to advocate for this legislation. In 1964, you also had the Republican National Convention meeting in San Francisco, and Dr. King came to the Republican National Convention, where he advocated for the passage of civil rights legislation. He also, at that time in 1964, since we're talking about fair housing, advocated for legislation to outlaw housing discrimination. So we know the 1968 Fair Housing Act was the legislation that ultimately did it. But in 1964, Dr. King was saying we need laws to prohibit housing discrimination. And California was the place to really make this case, because just the year before, in 1963, California had passed the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which came out of the Bay Area, which was a very bold fair housing law, which was a model for the rest of the nation. But then in 1964, many Californians said this was a step too far. We want to roll this back. And Dr. King came to California to say, no, 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 we have to keep moving forward. Do not roll this back. And it's sad to say that it was our association in 1964, realtors in California, who led the charge to turn back the Rumford Fair Housing Law. And the majority of white Californians voted for what was called Proposition 14 to turn back that law, despite King's advocacy. And it was a pretty radical move to do that, to turn back this fair housing law. And the Supreme Court in 1966 said that the action that California took at the behest of the realtors was unconstitutional. And so, that was California's major role in 1964, 60 years ago, with respect to fair housing. And then it wasn't until 1968 that we got a national law. And once again, Dr. King's advocacy was key to that. He spent pretty much from 1966 to 1968 championing fair housing legislation, and dramatized the need for it by going to live in Chicago for about 18 months, where he decried segregation in northern cities and described it as worse than the conditions that he had seen and experienced in the South, in terms of how it limited opportunity for African Americans. So, and then I think we all know, on this date, 56 years ago, Dr. King was assassinated, and then President Johnson was able to push through the civil rights legislation that was stalled in Congress, and got it through the Congress and signed it within 7 days of Dr. King's assassination. So that was the long, tortuous birth of the Fair Housing Act. And once again, I have to say that our association, even in 1968, for the same reasons that California had opposed fair housing legislation in 1964, had opposed it. But the nation prevailed and passed this legislation. The Fair Housing Act, when it was first passed, did not cover all of the bases that are now prohibited. It was race, color, national origin, and religion. It was amended in 1974, exactly 50 years ago, to prohibit sex discrimination. That same year, our country passed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which recognized discrimination in credit. And what's interesting is the 1974 Equal Credit Opportunity Act just prohibited discrimination in credit on the basis of sex. There was an effort to cover other prohibited bases, but those got stalled. And so Congress, in the interest of having legislation, did still pass a law that prohibited sex discrimination. And if you know, in 1974, for a woman to try to get a mortgage loan or credit of any kind, like just getting a simple credit card, was a challenge. Women would go into lending institutions to get a credit card and would be asked about their marital status. They would be asked if they were going to have children. They would have their salaries devalued based on the assumption that they weren't going to continue to work, regardless of what they said. They were asked to have a male cosigner. So all of this interrogation would go on if a woman simply wanted to get a credit card. And obviously, even more challenging if a woman wanted to get a mortgage for a home. And so this law was passed to prohibit that. And of course, it required many years of enforcement to be effective. Today, there is still discrimination in the credit realm on the basis of sex. When I was at HUD, the kinds of cases we saw about a decade ago or so tended to be cases where women would go on maternity leave with plans to return to work, but where lenders, again, would interrogate whether that was true and would question this and sometimes deny loans. But a range of discrimination cases occur. And, sometimes we see these cases in housing where people are asked, if there's going to be a man living in the house, let's say buying a house in Wisconsin where there's snow, because they believe you need a man there in order to shovel the snow. And so we've seen people actually denied housing because of their sex. So that continues. And, that same year, 1974, the Fair Housing Act was amended to prohibit sex discrimination and went in force with ECOA. ECOA did add race discrimination 2 years later. So this law continues to be a very powerful law to protect people in mortgage and other transactions, along with the Fair Housing Act. I'll say that one very powerful provision of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which is now getting a lot more currency, is a provision for what's called special purpose credit programs. So when ECOA was amended in 1976, Congress said that it was permissible to include provisions that would allow, and they actually use this word in the debate, affirmative discrimination. So in other words, groups that had historically faced discrimination could be offered more favorable terms and conditions, such as reduced interest rates or assistance with down payment, if they were a group that had faced historical discrimination, so based on race or ethnicity. So Congress actually recognized in 1974 that historical discrimination had put certain groups at a disadvantage and said that lenders could create programs that would favorably consider otherwise prohibited factors such as race or national origin or gender. And this kind of lay dormant for almost 50 years until very recently, many lenders said, these gaps in home ownership, these gaps in wealth are really hard to overcome because of historical discrimination, the legacy of discrimination. Is there something more proactive we can do? And they said, well, actually, the law has allowed for something for almost 50 years. And they contacted HUD and said, this has been in the law in the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Can we act on this? We know the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race or national origin or sex. This seems to be permissible discrimination, but with fair housing, if we followed ECOA, would we be in trouble with the Fair Housing Act? And HUD put out guidance saying that the two laws work in harmony, and that HUD would not consider it a violation of the Fair Housing Act to create a special purpose credit program as described under ECOA. And so for the last few years, really for the last 2 to 3 years, many lenders have been exploring these programs and trying to create these programs, but they still have been very careful to dance around the question of race. So even though 50 years ago or 48 years ago when these amendments were passed, the law said you could explicitly offer favorable terms in a special purpose credit program based on race or national origin or sex. Many lenders are afraid to go there. And so instead they will choose certain neighborhoods, or they'll choose low income neighborhoods, or they'll use proxies for race. But that's an interesting place that we're in right now, where essentially laws that have been on the books in order to correct historical injustice, folks are now beginning to rediscover and appreciate that even though 50 years have passed, we may still need to avail ourselves of these. So special purpose credit programs, you'll continue to hear more about. And as California Realtors, you may be aware that your own association created a special purpose credit program. I think it's the only state association to have created such a program. And meanwhile, the head of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau has been encouraging more parties to create these, and many people are interested in hearing more about the California Realtor program too, to see if some of those can be replicated in other places. So today, 2024, when we look at these issues, while discrimination no doubt has abated, it has not gone away. And in some ways, even treating people fairly, we find, does not close the existing gaps. So we know that when it comes to home ownership, there is a gap in the rate of home ownership between whites and all other racial groups. So the gap between whites and Asians is about it's about 10 percentage points, almost 15 percentage points. The gap between whites and Hispanics is about 25 percentage points. Hispanics have about 50% home ownership rate right now, with whites at 74%. And then the gap between African Americans and whites is almost 30 percentage points, with the African American home ownership rate at about 45%. So fewer than half of African Americans own homes compared to 3/4 of whites. And so even if people are treated fairly, this particular disparity has a way of replicating itself, where groups have a difficult time still catching up. And we see this in the data that NAR reviews every year. We put out something called the snapshot of home buying by race, and every year. And when we look at that, some interesting things jump out. One, we see that the percentage of home buyers of color is quite small. So from year to year, they represent a very small group. And I want to say African-American home buyers represented maybe like 5% of home buyers or something very shockingly small. But even then, when you look at these figures, when you look at who's actually buying a home in a given year, some interesting things jump out. One, the majority of home buyers in America year after year have, at least single home buyers, have been women. So married couples first, but then women. So it shows us some of the progress we have made. And then when you look at particular racial groups, it's even more pronounced. So African Americans, for example, the homeownership rate among single women versus single men is dramatic. That single women overwhelmingly represent the single home buyers among African Americans, and they tend to be higher educated, have higher levels of education than all home buyers of all races. And if you wonder, well, why would that be? And it's largely because people who are African American who are going to buy homes actually have to overcome the lack of family wealth. And so the individual home buyer has to attain higher levels of education, to have higher incomes, to make up for the fact that there is no family wealth, say, to provide a down payment, and to find the funds for closing costs and the like. So and when you look at the surveys we do, whites tend to have, by 2-to-1, sometimes 3-to-1 margin, depending on which groups you're looking at, higher rates of past home ownership that provided the equity for the down payment. So that's very significant. You also find that African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to be tapping into their retirement savings in order to find the money for down payment. So that's significant. Retirement and pensions, because again, there is not family wealth to bring to the table. And then finally, there are much higher rates of student loan debt among African Americans and Hispanics, again, showing that because there hasn't been the family wealth to pay for education, people are going into significant student loan debt in order to get the education, which is necessary to get the income in turn to buy a house. And so addressing student loan debt in some way or another, or taking it into account, could make a big difference in increasing home ownership. And so many people have been aware of that and have been trying to figure out ways to address that. But all of these issues are trying to account for historical inequity. And whether you're talking about special purpose credit programs or dealing with student loan debt, it's all a recognition that it's very challenging for any group to that's had faced historical discrimination to get ahead unless there's some intervention to deal with these different issues. And then I just want to layer on top of that, what's continuing to make this charge even more challenging is the lack of housing inventory. That we in the United States are about 5.5 million units short, by some measures, close to 7 million units short of what we should have in this country. And the lack of supply is what drives up, what most is the greatest contributor to unaffordable housing prices. And so we can make more progress in closing these gaps if we were to build more housing and build more housing throughout our communities. So why aren't we doing it? Home builders will tell you that it's too expensive to build. Land costs are the biggest factor for them. Land costs are too great. They're also facing labor shortages, a shortage of skilled labor that they need. But the land costs we could potentially deal with, and Californians know this better than almost anybody, if we confront some of our zoning and land use regulations. So being able to address our very restrictive zoning and land use would allow for denser building, and just more housing. And Americans have always known that zoning and very tight zoning could drive up home costs and keep people out of communities. And so we have to make a commitment, or governments need to create incentives for communities to relax zoning so we can build more housing. So that's going to be key. And unless and until we do that, these gaps that I've described will not only persist, but they will become more pronounced. And so that is a fair housing challenge, because the downstream effects of past discrimination, even if we've addressed them in law, and even if the outright discrimination that we saw in the 60s when these laws were passed may have greatly abated, now just market forces are going to perpetuate inequality. So we have to address that. We have to address it soon. And when you look at it, and it's quite stark. I think we have a problem in the country that people are not well informed of just how stark the problem is. Yale University did a study recently asking Americans what their understanding was of the wealth gap in the country. And Americans thought, yeah, there is a wealth gap. And they said the wealth gap, particularly between African Americans and whites, was the largest, but they thought of it as like, 10 to 20% gap, that for every dollar whites had, that perhaps blacks had 80 cents. When the reality is, it's for every dollar a white person has, African Americans have 10 or 15 cents. Incomes are closer, maybe 80% to 100%, but wealth, which is very much seen in this home ownership gap, is stark, with whites having about 10% of the wealth. And it is hard to overcome that without some kind of intervention. So we need to be aware of it. We need to recognize the continued societal impact of not addressing it. But more importantly, we need to find ways to actually do something about it. So we are very actively involved in the National Association of Realtors with partners who are trying to increase housing production. There's a group called Up for Growth, which has been building a network throughout the country of organizations, individuals, governments who recognize the need for a national housing strategy, and the recognition that we are only going to be able to be prosperous in the future if we take steps now to make sure the next generation of Americans have housing opportunity. And yeah, it is becoming a crisis. It's reaching crisis proportions. John Oliver, the comedian who does the show Last Week Tonight, made a point of saying, when he had a show on homeowners associations, he made a point of saying that this show is not for anyone under 35. He said, because you will never effing own a home. And that was a joke, but the joke was biting, in particular because young people recognize that home ownership is becoming increasingly out of reach. And like I said, it's even more acute for young people of color. So if we want the next generation to be prosperous and to have the opportunities that earlier generations had, we need to make that investment. So that is our biggest fair housing challenge today. So I'm going to leave it there. I would be happy to answer questions. I know we covered quite a lot there.
Yeah.
So Vanessa, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no problem. Super informative. Also very interesting to hear that while you were spanning many years, it's not necessarily ancient history, which you're talking about.
Yeah,
Many of these things are quite recent.
I'm ancient history, but yeah.
Um, so we did have a few questions come in. The first one was a question around when you were talking about World War II. Somebody was asking if the benefits for GI Bills or POW housing benefits, were those also segregated?
Oh, absolutely. And my friend Richard Rothstein, who lives out there in the Bay Area, he's written quite a bit about this in The Color of Law. So yeah, the GI benefit is probably the prime example of how inequality was fostered in the country, because veterans came home and white veterans had this, well, everyone supposedly had this benefit, but white veterans could actually act on the benefit, on the housing benefit, and low interest loans, little down, and get a loan and buy a house. African Americans couldn't get loans to buy houses anywhere. And it was intentionally left to the states to implement the GI Bill. And so certainly if you're in the Black Belt, or any of the southern states, you weren't going to get any help. But it was the same, in the North. Banks did not make loans to African Americans. And so so much of the middle class that we know of, that most of us who are on this call grew up with, was created by that unequal benefit that whites could avail themselves of and blacks couldn't. And entire subdivisions were created after the war for veterans to use their benefits, that and they were intentionally either segregating, keeping out people of color, and or people of color couldn't live there because they couldn't get loans.
Yes, obviously, and then that leads to imbalances in generational wealth down the line as well.
Yeah. And it's not that long ago. I mean, it's just like a generation or two. I mean, my father missed World War II, but he was in the military in the early 50s. My father actually would have been among the first group of African Americans to serve in integrated troops, because we did not integrate our military until 1948. And so he went in I think 1951.
Yes, crazy to think that people were putting their lives out there for their country and could not get the same basics as their fellow soldiers. We have another question. I think you talked a little bit about what some of the lending groups are doing in terms of special programs, but this person's wondering, is NAR or CAR, if you know about it, working on any legislation that is addressing generational wealth imbalances created by racial discrimination?
Not directly. It's interesting. I know that Congressman Takano out of California was interested specifically in this issue of veterans benefits. And there are actually, I think, a few other members of Congress who've talked to us about how can we make up for this inequity. So there is some talk about, is there something through VA that can be done to acknowledge that history. I mean, we know there's hardly any legislation moving forward, not to mention, such bold progressive legislation like that. But people are talking about it. And, I want to say, I feel like Clyburn might have something too, Congressman Clyburn. So, but always open to ideas. If people have ideas of what might be viable, happy to hear them.
Certainly, if we get any, I'll pass them along.
Mm-hmm.
So there are definitely lots of incentives, especially here in California, where the cost of housing is very high, even more so in the Bay Area. But sometimes these programs that might be set up for particular groups of people get infiltrated by people who already have advantages. So wondering what might be some effective ways of public policy that encourage first-time home buyers of color specifically.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and it's a point that I've made. So, I've had the opportunity to testify before the HUD secretary, the CFPB director, the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. All of them had people come in and talk about special purpose credit programs and how could they be made more effective. And I said, well, the biggest problem is lenders are fearful of using the law as it's written. And the law as it's written, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, going back to the 70s, signed by Gerald Ford, said you could create a program specifically for certain groups to overcome past discrimination. And you can lower interest rates, you can provide down payment assistance and the like. But all of the lenders who have acted on this have they've come up with criteria which actually could benefit people who haven't faced historical discrimination even more. So if you said, we will lower your interest rate or provide you with down payment assistance if you buy a home in this census tract, that census tract might be majority Hispanic or Asian or Black, whatever. But anyone who decided to purchase a home in that census tract would be the beneficiary. So it's not necessarily the people in that census tract. It could be anybody. And so I think many lenders are just afraid that someone will sue them. And despite what these federal agencies say, because all of the heads of these federal agencies are saying, we support you, go do it. They're concerned that the courts, another branch of government might say, we find this unconstitutional. Doesn't matter what the 1976 amendments to ECOA said. We think we don't need to do this anymore in America. And so that's the problem. And so people have not been bold, and, we've not even been able to get data from these lenders. They will talk a lot about these programs, and they're quite proud of them. But if you ask them, well, who's being served, they won't provide you with the data. And so I'm very concerned because it may exacerbate things. The other thing too, and one of the reasons why I don't like these sort of geographic programs is they could also perpetuate segregation, right?
Right.
And so the people who would be most qualified for a loan, as I said from the data, are going to be people with higher levels of education. And so you're essentially and I said women too. So you're essentially telling, this woman who has become a lawyer or has an MBA, she expects or thinks she'll maybe live among her peers. But because her parents were laborers, they weren't lawyers like her. She didn't have the family wealth to send herself to school, so she's got debt, etc. But she's with her peers. For her to buy a house, you're telling her, oh, and you've got to go live in the inner city. That's where you need to be, And so, it'd be better for these programs to be bold and to assign the benefit to the person. But like I said, lenders seem to be scared of that. But I do think there should be more public accounting to find out, okay, you've created this program, who has it benefited? And it would really be perverse if a special purpose credit program benefits people who've had past privilege. Now, the other thing too is they sometimes will say, to make sure it doesn't benefit privileged people, will put a income cap on who could participate. And they think, well, maybe this will skew it more to Asians or Hispanics or Blacks. But even if you put that cap on, then you can't afford the house. I mean, most, you actually have to have a pretty high income to afford a house. And so while many people might not think this is the group you should be trying to help. I've said in many forums, you really need programs that are going to help young professional people of color, because they're the persons who are going to be most qualified to purchase. They're also going to have probably a lot of student loan debt, but they need help. They've done all the right things, and homeownership is going to be out of reach. If you create programs for some other class of persons or persons who have less income, that money will just go unspent because they can't afford to purchase homes. I do believe the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco may be making some inroads. I have to go look at their material again, but I actually testified before them too and made this point. And I don't think it fell completely on deaf ears, but I think people were just kind of surprised because they're not used to a suggestion that higher income people, are the persons who may need this help most. And what I really mean, they need and are the ones who are best positioned to utilize it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sometimes when working specifically in San Francisco with these caps, if your income's at a certain point, it's almost as if you need a parent who's got the extra cash to help you get through the program. So it's helping people who already also have some generational wealth assistance too. Here's an interesting question. Wondering if there is any concerns that the resolution of our pending NAR lawsuit will disproportionately impact non-white home buyers with the new conversation around buyer agent compensation agreements.
We're certainly hearing concerns. So, once, prior to the settlement, information regarding compensation would be in the multiple listing service. Now it's decentralized. And while sellers or sellers agents can advertise compensation on their websites, or that information can be shared off the MLS, people have raised concerns about consistency. And people have raised concerns that if fewer sellers offer compensation, buyers are going to have to come out of pocket. Buyers, as part of the proposed settlement, would also have to, the buyer's agent and the buyers will have to enter into an agreement, a buyer's broker's agreement. And so there are concerns that buyers may have to pay out of pocket, and assuming that home prices remain the same, that's an additional cost for buyers. And it's more challenging for buyers of color to bear those costs. So those are all concerns. I mean, I think ultimately the real questions are going to be just how this plays out in the market. You do hear real estate professionals, some of the bigger ones out there in the media, who are saying they believe sellers are going to continue to want to pay compensation in order to get as many buyers' eyes on their property and potentially get the best cost for their home. And so if buyers' compensation continues off the MLS, you would hope that all would continue to benefit from that. But it is going to be less transparent, for sure. And then there's a whole other range of concerns about veterans, because the VA program does not allow veterans to pay their buyer agents out of pocket, directly. So they can only benefit from a buyer's agent if the buyer's agent doesn't charge or if the seller pays the buyer's agent. So there are a lot of concerns to be worked out. But, I think what is heartening is our industry is concerned and looking out for everybody. And so this is going to be the conversation. I appreciate that everyone recognizes that buyers drive the transactions, and we want as many buyers who are in housing to be out there and, have access to the housing.
Yes. very glad to hear that people are concerned. And you can correct me here. Would it be under your department who might be following the stats and tracking this in the upcoming?
Yeah, it's kind of like an entire enterprise effort, but yeah, my office is very much involved in that.
Well, that's good to hear, and I'm glad that your office exists. I know it's recent. We have time for maybe one more question here. I'll pick this one. So the California Association of Realtors, I'm not sure if you know this, but we've established our own reparations task force here in the
I did not know that.
Yes. We're pretty proud of it. And we've also hired a DEI consultant for the California Association of Realtors. So we're working with professionals there. But even though this is new information, what are your thoughts about reparations? And more importantly, how do you think NAR will view these? How does NAR feel about reparations?
We're a federalist system, so it doesn't really matter what we think, right? California is free to do what California wants to do. And I see the question was from Alan. I'm glad to see Alan here. You know, for one, there's a wide range of groups, right? We all know about Japanese internment, as well as how we treated Native Americans and you know, other Asian discrimination, African American. So you've got a wide range of groups who have been harmed in some way. So I think it's important to sort of figure out just how you document that harm. I think it's important to figure out how you connect the dots, right? You know, are we trying to compensate people who can prove the injury, or are we describing broad classes of people who, because we know these groups were targeted, if you're in that group, you gain a benefit? I'm certainly open to that conversation always. I think the more that you can direct it to people who have a demonstrable harm, the better. And as you pointed out, Vanessa, this stuff is not that old. You know, within 1 or 2 generations, you should be able to connect the dots. And I think most people, if you do it that way, you know, most people can support it. They can, because they can see a connection. You face challenges when people sort of say, oh, you know, there's always the, well, what about Oprah? You know, people Oprah overcame a lot. Let me just say, people always act as if you know, Oprah was born with a silver spoon in her mouth. But I think the more that you can connect it and demonstrate that people have faced an injury and you're trying to make them whole, and I think the data is there for a lot of people. So I think that's probably the best way to go about it. But I'm looking forward to hearing more about it.
Great. Well, we will be sure to keep you apprised. And that's actually another, if any of our participants that were watching today had any suggestions or recommendations, like you had asked information to be passed on, where's the best way for them to send things to you?
So I'm going to put my email in the chat. It's bgreene, BGREENE at NAR.realtor. But I'm also going to put it in the chat. I also shared in the chat a story I wrote for Smithsonian Magazine about Black veterans and the fight for freedom and how that launched the civil rights movement. It begins with a case of a veteran, a Navy veteran, who bought a home in Palo Alto and had it burnt to the ground right after the war in 1946. And you know, speaking to the housing challenge, how, you know, even if you were coming back as a veteran, people didn't want you in their neighborhoods. I write for the Smithsonian and have done a number of articles. So this one, I think, is particularly germane to housing. At the beginning and the end, there's some talk about housing.
Well, perfect. I'm so glad you had all that spare time to write that Smithsonian. Busy man. Well, it was truly a pleasure to have you here today speaking to our association. It was incredibly informative. For those of you who were joining, hopefully this was some good information, some inspiring information. And Bryan has given you his direct email address, a really a kind gesture there. So you can certainly reach out if you have
always happy to talk. Yeah.
Questions. Yes, thank you so much. And appreciate you kicking off Fair Housing Month here in San Francisco. So
thanks for having me.
No problem. And have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Take care.